Right. Okay, today we want to look at our obedience rating. How would you rate your obedience to God? Are we obedient servants to God? How would you rate that obedience? Or are we only obedient when it is convenient? Or are we servants who make compromises when it comes to obeying God? So today I want to look at some examples from the Bible of God's servants who obeyed God no matter what God commanded. And these are some of the men who have books written after them. So we look at Ezekiel, Hosea, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. They were servants of God, and they have books written in the Bible that God preserved. So we'll begin today by looking at Ezekiel. We begin in Ezekiel chapter 4. We'll begin in verse 4, going down to verse 15, but I wouldn't read all. But these are this verse tells what God told Ezekiel to do. So in verse 4, God tells Ezekiel to lie on his side, on his left side, where people could see in the public. And in verse 5, God told him he had to do it for 390 days. And in verse 6, God told him, after you are finished, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the people of Judah. I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year. And then verse 8, he was to be tied up in ropes so that he couldn't move while lying on the side for 390, then 40 days. And then look at what God told him to do in verse 9. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. He told them how much water to drink at set times. But verse 12, eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread, bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel. Well, he had a problem with this part, and he complained to God, and God in verse 15 changed the instruction and said, I will let you bake your bread over cow dung instead of human excrement. So what God was doing was giving an object lesson to the people of Israel and Judah because of the sins that they were committing against him. And he was sending Ezekiel with this object lesson to wake them up, to change their ways. Ezekiel, even though God commanded him to do something difficult, he obeyed. When you study the book of Ezekiel further, in chapter 5, he was called upon to shave his entire hair. All the hair on his body, he was called upon to shave. Chapter 12, God commanded him to dig a hole in the wall, crawl through it. And in chapter 25, his wife died. And God commanded him and told him, you cannot mourn for your wife. You have to continue serving me diligently. And throughout all of these commands that God gave Ezekiel, he obeyed. He obeyed every one of them. I know I might have tried to compromise or question. Sometimes when people give us commands, we say, you sure you want me to do that? You sure? Because we always have doubts. But Ezekiel didn't do that. He obeyed God. Another servant like that is Hosea. Hosea was a prophet in the time of Amos, Isaiah, and Micah. He's considered one of the minor prophets. And he was sent to the northern kingdom of Israel just before they went into captivity. And God gave Hosea interesting commands also. In the beginning of his commission, God commanded him to go and find a prostitute and marry her. And this is recorded in chapter 1, verses 2 to 3. And I'm reading from the NIV. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." So God was again sending a message to the children of Israel. And he was using his prophets, his servants, to send this message. Even though they were obedient to God, they had to obey God and do these commands that we wouldn't necessarily do, because they had to send a message to the children of Israel. Later in the book, if you study Hosea, his wife left him, and God instructed Hosea to buy his wife back. We go to chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, where God commanded him to go and buy his wife back. So in verse 2, "So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and letek of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you." So Hosea obeyed God. He didn't question God. It's not recorded that Hosea questioned God. He obeyed God. He married a prostitute. He had children with her. She left him. She went back to her life, and God instructed him, go back, buy her from whoever she was in servitude to, and live with her. And he obeyed. I'm sure many men wouldn't have done that. We would have tried to compromise with God and say no. What about Jeremiah? In Jeremiah 13, God told Jeremiah to buy a loincloth, the underwear at that time, and wear it for some time without washing it. And then in public, he had to take it and hide it under some rocks. Then God instructed him to take it out and display it for everyone to see. God commanded him in chapter 14, not to get married. He was forbidden from getting married. He wanted to have a family. God forbade him. And in chapter 27, he had to wear an oxen yoke and walk around with it. His ministry was one of object lessons, again, that God was using to send a message to people who were not listening. And God's servants had to do these things for people who were not listening. They were obedient people, but they had to do these things because they were obedient to God. Isaiah also was given a command. He had to walk around naked or nearly naked for 3 whole years. Isaiah 20, verses 2 to 3. At that time, the Lord spoke through Isaiah, son of Amos. He said to him, take off the sackcloth from your body and the sandals from your feet. And he did so. No record of complaining. Going around stripped and barefoot. Then the Lord said, just as my servant Isaiah has gone stripped and barefoot for 3 years, as a sign and portent against Egypt and Cush. In the New Testament, God's servants underwent various trials. When God called Paul in Acts 9, verses 15 and 16, he told him in verse 16, I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. And during Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, Paul indeed suffered beatings, stonings, imprisonment, and they are listed for us in the New Testament. Many biblical scholars believe that John was the only disciple to die a natural death. All the rest suffered, were killed because of the calling that they had. What difficult thing has God called us to do now? We saw servants in the Old Testament had to do difficult things. Paul had to endure severe trials. What difficult thing has God called us to do? I am thankful that I haven't been called to follow exactly those things that Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah had to do. But we have commands in the New Testament. We have lots of commands. Christ gave us many commands in the New Testament to follow. Are we being obedient? Because I'm sure they do not rival the shame and embarrassment that those servants would have had to endure. Hosea, Jeremiah. For example, James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. Do we do that? And to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Are we keeping ourselves unspotted from the world? Christ gave certain commands before he left. Love the brethren. Are we loving the brethren? Loving our enemies. Do we love our enemies? Really? Preaching the gospel. Are we actively preaching the gospel? That's the last command Christ gave before he ascended to heaven. We are called constantly to remain steadfast, obey the commandments, and serve others continuously. We must strive to overcome sin, pray, fast, and study the word of God. I recently read about a servant of God. Anybody knows this gentleman? He was in this book. His name is Bill Robinson, and you can read about him. I will just read something that his wife wrote about him. Because of time, I can't read all the comments that people said, but in reading what his wife said about him, I was struck by his obedience to God. So I'm reading now. Bill Robinson came to adulthood at an ideal time for a college-educated Black American man. After the tumultuous years of the civil rights struggle, he was recruited and hired into an executive training program by Sears, then the largest retailer of consumer goods in the country. So he got a good job with the largest retailer in the United States. He excelled at the job and received high ratings until he learned that God commanded him to keep the Sabbath. And what he did? His decision to obey God rather than man caused an executive to fly into Baltimore directly from Sears' Chicago headquarters to remind him that he had received a racial accommodation to enter the program. So we give you a special accommodation and you going to leave that? That conflicted with the country's largest shopping day of the week, which was the Sabbath day. And this is what she writes in here about him. Bill went from the number 2 manager in a large store to pumping gas at the auto center. He gave it up. He left. He never had another opportunity to pursue an executive career position. But from his baptism in 1976 until his death, Bill was committed to obeying God, loving and serving the brethren, and serving his family. So he gave up that position that he had to serve God. to go from a managerial position to the gas station, pumping gas. And never again he got back a job where he was a manager again. One lesson that we can learn from all these servants we look at, they all remained faithful and were obedient to God, all of them. I have known people who have had to give up, who were given the prospect of giving up the job for the Sabbath, and they chose the job. People I grew up in church with, friends I have, and they chose the job. Others chose the Sabbath. Bill Robinson chose God, obeying God. So all of them remained faithful, those in the Old Testament, New Testament. Bill, are we prepared to follow their examples in obedience? We don't know what difficult decision would come our way. And as we see the world trending towards a wokeness agenda, where LGBTQIWXYZ decisions would have to be made in the workplace, this would impact on many of us. Are we prepared to obey God rather than man? Will we compromise? Or would we remain faithful? What is our obedience rating? That's the question I want to leave with us. Soon we will be called upon to make decisions, hard decisions. And these decisions will test whether we remain faithful to God or man. So today I want to leave us with the message that we must examine our obedience rating. How would we rate? Or would we obey only when it is convenient to us?